in your words, how would you describe trauma, and why is it so misunderstood even though it's so widespread?
It's a deep question because on the one hand, trauma is sometimes used somewhat loosely and promiscuously to refer to things that are not traumatic. So people will have a difficult experience and say, I was traumatized. No, they weren't. They just had a difficult experience. And as one of my colleagues points out, all trauma is stressful, but not every stress is traumatic. So sometimes people use the word to refer to difficult experiences, which is not the same as being traumatized. And on the other hand, where it really matters, which is in the area of health that you and I are both concerned in, whether it's physical or mental health, trauma is not understood nearly enough or used nearly enough. So that, to my mind, a lot of conditions of mind and body are actually very much trauma-related without the healing profession, particularly the medical profession, actually recognizing it. So trauma then it comes from the Greek word for wounding. Trauma is a wound. It's a psychic wound that leaves a scar, it leaves an imprint in your nervous system, in your body, in your psyche, and then shows up in multiple ways that are not helpful to you later on. So in its basic sense, trauma is a psychic wound. And if you look at the nature of a wound, on the one hand, if it's raw and open, it really hurts. So when somebody touches that wound that you sustained a long time ago, but it hasn't healed yet, you'll react like you're just being tormented all over again. This happens in relationships all the time. On the other hand, wounds scar over, and the scar tissue has certain features. It's very hard, it's rigid, so it's not flexible. So people tend to be rigid when they're traumatized. It also doesn't grow. So trauma very often stops emotional growth and development. So on the one hand, it's very raw and painful. On the other hand, it's even lacks sensation because scar tissue doesn't have nerve endings in it. So trauma then, just to finish, is not what happened to you. So trauma is not the difficult incidents, like trauma is not the war. It's not in my case, the Second World War when I was born or what happened to me. Trauma is not the abuse that people experience. Trauma is not the pain that they felt. Trauma is the wound that they sustained as a result. So the trauma wasn't, for example, the sexual abuse. Trauma was the wound that the person sustained as a result of having been abused. That's the good news, Jay, because if trauma is the wound that we sustained, it can be healed at any time. If trauma is what happened to me 75 years ago or 78 years ago, it happened. It never not will have happened. You know, the partition of India wounded a lot of people, but it'll never not have happened. But if the wound is what happened to people inside as a result, that can be healed.
That's probably the best differentiator that I've heard. And you're right, it is good news because it means we can heal it.
Exactly.
What do you think are the biggest, going the opposite way, we're talking about a wound, and I want to come back to that, but going the opposite way, how would you then define healing? Because that's another word like trauma that is also just everywhere now, right? Self-healing, healing from this, healing from that. I think healing is such a interesting concept in and of itself, which again is rarely defined or made clear to us. And from your studies, I would love to hear your thoughts in the same ways you did for trauma. What is healing?
Sure. So you mentioned to me that you spent some time in my homeland of Hungary, where I was born. And the Hungarian word for health actually begins with the word for wholeness. So health literally means wholeness. And the English word for healing and health also come from an Anglo-Saxon origin, meaning wholeness. So for some reason, languages internationally have intuited the sense of healing, which is a sense of completion and wholeness. Now, what trauma does is it disconnects us. It splits us off from our true self and disconnects us from our emotions, even from our bodies. So that if that disconnection is the essence of trauma, then the healing is that coming together of the self to become whole again. And healing is often used synonymously with cure, fair enough, but strangely enough, in my view, and not just in my view, people can be cured from an illness without becoming whole, without healing. People sometimes also become healed without being cured. So in that sense, healing is not the absence of a physical illness, but it's the integrity of a person who's no longer split off from themselves.
I think what we find is that trauma is so, as you said, a wound that is long lasting. It can often be that way.
Yeah.
But healing is a process that we want to happen now,
Yeah.
or today,
Yeah.
or tomorrow.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by how does time, we've always heard time will heal, right? Like that's an old cliche.
It won't.
Yeah, right. So let's go back to the wound and talk about, is there any relationship between time and wounds or unhealed wounds? And what is that relationship? How is that wound being formed internally? As you said, trauma is not what happens to you, it's what happens inside of you. That which is happening inside of you, what is happening with that wound over time when it's left?
What happens is that it may lie dormant for a long time, and then something occurs that touches it. It's when we talk about people being triggered, for example. Something touches an unhealed wound inside you, and you react, you've just been wounded for the first time. And certainly I can tell you that's been the case for me. For example, in my marriage relationship, is that the unhealed wounds, you may think you've gone past them, but then something will happen that touches that wound, and you react like you're being tormented all over again for the first time. And time does not automatically heal.
Mm-hmm.
Time maybe scars it over, time maybe makes it less available to immediate memory, but should something happen to evoke it, it's going to show up in its full painful impact until you do some work to heal. Time by itself does not heal, not spontaneously, not automatically. So pain is inevitable, but it doesn't have to become traumatic if the child is supported in experiencing the pain and moving past it. So we don't have to impose or bring pain into kids' life to train them. Life's going to do that. The question is, how are we to interact with them while they're enduring the pain?
Yeah, and what would you say those are? Obviously, there's the love part, which you spoke about, but when a child is going through something like that, so let's talk about loss, because I think that's a big one, right? Like whether it's losing a parent or losing a puppy, as you said, or even if it's not losing a parent to death, it's losing a parent to a divorce. It's,
for example,
correct, yeah. So grief and loss doesn't have to mean end of life. It can be everything.
Exactly.
Or a loss of a country. What are the steps that someone should take in order to help guide through anyone through loss, not just a child?
Well, interestingly enough, when I spoke about these brain circuits that we share with other mammals for play and for loving and seeking, we also have a brain circuit for panic and grief. Why do we have that? Because life brings loss. And so grief is essential for life, because grief is coming to terms with the fact that something is gone, is not going to come back. So when a child experiences grief, and I said that the need of the child is to be able to experience all the emotions, they need to be able to experience the grief as well. And it doesn't matter whether from adult eyes we see that loss as major or minor. It's a question of how is the child experiencing it. And for a small child, even what looks like small losses can be very painful. Well, then we don't make the child wrong for it. We don't say, get over it, there's nothing wrong. Think of all the other children who are suffering, all that kind of relativistic, shaming stuff. We say, oh, it really hurts, doesn't it? You really wish grandpa would be here with you. You really wish mom and dad weren't leaving each other. It hurts. In other words, you just validate their emotions. By doing so, you help them accept the loss, and you help them move through, and you help them learn that they can endure difficult emotions without having to falling to pieces. So we have a circuitry for grief in our brain, for grief in our brains. It needs to be allowed to do its work.
I find that a lot of us today are reflecting on that inner child, right? Like that language is, again, more widespread today, or is growing. The idea of like, oh, we have this inner child who has this wound or this trauma. What do you find is the difference between analyzing and overanalyzing, or thinking and overthinking these experiences? And how would you define the difference? Because and I'm being very honest and vulnerable, because it's the only way to have this conversation, really. Like, I often think about events in my life that happened that would be considered generally as either difficult experiences or as traumatic, right? They could be seen as either or. There are some of them that I've worked through myself or with people that I trust or with guides and obviously through my monk life. There were things that I looked at and worked on. There are certain things that I don't feel a need, like I don't feel a desire to dive into. The question I'm asking is, should I dive into them? Or is that considered overanalyzing and overthinking? And I ask that for everyone else who's listening to this going, gosh, if I thought about everything that happened to me, I could be there for a while. What's your take on that?
Well, first of all, in my world, there's no shoulds, okay?
There
are no shoulds.
There's no shoulds, yeah.
So I would never say to anybody, you should, because that itself is intrusive. So the question is whether it's helpful or not to delve into the past depends on what's happening with that individual. And if some of the effects of trauma, as we said earlier, is that the wounds of the past keep showing up in the present. So from my point of view, it's not so much about delving into the past and dwelling on the past, but on dealing with how the past is showing up in the present. What a psychologist friend of mine, Peter Levine, calls the tyranny of the past, where the past dominates my present reactions. It doesn't matter how many times I go back and think about my childhood story, that's not going to help me. What I have to deal with is what's happening to me right now at this very second, which is a shadow of the past. So thinking about it is not going to be of much help. What's going to help is to deal with the emotions that are arising now as a result of what happened and how those emotions affect my life in the present moment. So it's not about the past, it's about the present.
Yeah, so it's really about the choices we have now.
Exactly, what's available to us now.
Yeah, what's available to us now, because I feel like we didn't have a choice in the past because we were either too young or too incapable of making a choice.
Exactly.
But the choices that happen right now can transform everything.
It is possible. Some people do make themselves into victims. They kind of identify with the victim role. All this stuff happened to me, and therefore I cannot do such and such, or I'm hurt and I'll never get over it. It's possible to identify with the victim role. It's even possible to identify with the survivor role. I'm a survivor. Well, no, that's not who you are. You survived, but who you are is much greater than that particular experience, and who you are is always much greater than your suffering.
Yeah.
And so it is possible for some people to identify with the suffering and the past to such a degree that they stop moving forward. I think at the very least of it, the suffering had to be acknowledged and had to be heard and fully acknowledged. And then the healing can take place.
Yeah.
Without that, it can't.
Of course, absolutely.
Which is why it's so important to understand trauma. The suffering has to be acknowledged. Now, in my country, Canada, like when you talked about Rwanda, of course, that tribal hatred didn't just arise up from nowhere, nor is it necessarily in the nature of those people to be like that. A lot of it was the legacy of colonialism that quite deliberately, and you would know something about British colonialism, it quite deliberately set one group against another, the legacy of which was often tremendous struggle and hatred and violence. In Canada, as in the United States, the legacy of colonialism fell more particularly on our indigenous peoples, so that to this day, they suffer so much. The addiction rate is much higher amongst them. 50% of the women in jail in my country are indigenous people.
Wow.
They make up 5% of the population.
Wow.
An indigenous woman has 6 times the rate of rheumatoid arthritis. They never used to have rheumatoid arthritis prior to colonization. There's been some apologies in Canadian history, but there's been not sufficient acknowledgement of what actually happened and what continues to happen. And I'm saying that an essential condition for that healing would have to be acknowledgement. So the Pope came to Canada just maybe 6 weeks ago because the church cooperated with the state to abduct children from their homes, indigenous children from their homes, for over 100 years, into the 1990s, into these residential schools where our native children were not allowed to see their parents, where their culture was extirpated. They had pins stuck in their tongue if they spoke their tribal language. They were sexually abused. Often they died. They were physically abused. They were starved. And the Pope came and apologized. And you know what the apology was? I'm so sorry for what some Christians did to your people. Well, he means well as a person, but that was an apology uttered by an institution, because it wasn't, or it should have been uttered by the institution. But they said, what some Christians, it wasn't some Christians, it was the state, and it was the church. And what I'm saying is, that was a good first step. But until there's full acknowledgement and we are fully willing to hear the suffering of the people that we hurt, and that's why in the 12 steps, what do? They do this moral inventory. How did we hurt somebody, and how can we, without imposing on them, how can we acknowledge if that's appropriate? So I think for healing, whether for myself or people that I've hurt, there has to be acknowledgement. We have this idea that what is normal is also healthy and natural. And I'm saying that in this culture, the norm is neither healthy nor is it natural. In fact, the norm, I think, is making us sick.
Gabor Mate, welcome back to the show.
Nice to be back again. Thank you.
Dude, so good to have you. As we were talking about before we started rolling, your book, A, is incredible, but B, is very unnerving in the picture that it paints because it feels so accurate. It's a big book in terms of what it's taking on. So I want to start at the beginning. Explain to people, when you say the myth of normal, what do you mean? And then after that, we'll get into what a toxic culture is.
I mean, two things. We have this idea that what is normal is also healthy and natural. And I'm saying that in this culture, the norm is neither healthy nor is it natural. In fact, the norm, I think, is making us sick. Number one. Number two, we talk about illnesses and of body and mind as abnormalities. I'm saying that illness in this society, given the conditions, is a normal response to an abnormal circumstance. So that's what I mean by the myth of normal.
Okay, so obviously you go into great detail about this in the book. And I remember at one point stopping and taking the note, like, wait a second, basically everything that we think of, like you're saying, is sort of a normal result of aging, or, oh, this is, just some people have this kind of response and it is what it is. It's just natural. It's all coming back to trauma, and it's all coming back to childhood trauma and a specific idea that we'll get to in a minute. But I want to push a little bit on that idea. So why is what we see in terms of things that we would categorize as mental health issues or overly stressed lives, or all of the myriad things that we think of, like rheumatoid arthritis, one of the examples that you give. How is that an adaptive response?
Well, the rheumatoid arthritis is not an adaptive response in itself. It's the outcome of an adaptive response. So when you talk to people, and I've interviewed many, or you look at the research literature on who gets rheumatoid arthritis, it's people who are super conscientious. They have what's called hyper-autonomous self-sufficiency. In other words, they don't know how to ask for help. They look after the emotional needs of others rather than caring for their own. They tend to suppress their healthy anger, and they really try to fit in and not make waves. And these people, that's an adaptation. This is how they adapted to their childhood. They grew up in families where they were not accepted, seen for who they were. They might have been traumatized. The adaptation was to make themselves, to suppress their authentic emotions and to try and fit in with other people's expectations and to meet other people's needs. That's the adaptation. But that adaptation puts tremendous stress on the person, and that stress causes the illness. So what I'm saying is that the illness is the outcome of an adaptation.
Okay, so let's talk about that adaptation. So I think a lot about the human mind as having directives. There are things that we have been hardwired to do over millions of years of evolution through even, sort of the non-human part of our evolutionary tree up through where we are now. And so these directives get implanted, and it seems like your thesis is largely about the way that as a child, we go, okay, this is what our environment is. I don't have a secure attachment style.
Yeah.
Maybe my parents aren't paying attention to me. But what is the directive? Is the directive to get along? Is the directive to fit in? Like, what is the core directive that causes this to become pathological?
The core directive is twofold. One is we have to attach, we have to belong, we have to connect. But the other directive is that we have to do so while maintaining our own autonomy, our own authenticity. Auto means the self. So that means we have to be in touch with our gut feelings and our emotions and to be true to them. And so what we need is relationships in which we can be true to ourselves. That's the directive. Now, as soon as the directive changes because of, this is what we're wired for. For example, authenticity, being in touch with your gut feeling. Out there in the wild as a hunter-gatherer, how long do you survive if you're not in touch with your gut feelings? So that's an essential thing. But what if you grew up in a home where your honest emotions are not accepted by your parents? Let's say your parents have read Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life, where he actually says that an angry child should be made to sit by themselves till they come back to normal. Or that parents should be able to hit their kids in order to get them to comply. Now, if a child experiences healthy and normal anger of a 2-year-old, but the message he gets that if you're angry, you will not be accepted by us. In fact, you'll be excluded, you'll be given a time out, we won't even be with you until you come back to quote-unquote normal, then the child will adaptively repress their anger so as to maintain their relationship with their parents. So they give up their authenticity for the sake of the attachment. That giving up of the attachment suppresses not just the emotions, but because the emotions are physiologically connected to the immune system. In fact, they're part and parcel of the same apparatus. When you suppress your emotions, you're suppressing your immune system as well. And now you're asking, why are we seeing a rise of autoimmune disease in this society? Which we are. And as globalization spreads, we're seeing more autoimmune disease around the world. Is because people are more and more having to suppress themselves to fit in with the false expectations of a society. So that's the link.
All right, I'm going to see if I can hold all this in my head, because this is one of the most interesting core elements of the book, is this collision between authenticity and attachment.
Yes.
Used an incredible analogy that really hit me hard, and that's, you said the lung is not the response to an expectation of oxygen. The lung is the expectation of oxygen. Like it is the manifestation of that.
Yeah, if there was no oxygen, we'd have no lungs. Our lungs evolved as an expectation for oxygen.
Which makes total sense to me.
Yeah.
And and I'm paraphrasing here, but I think I'm pretty close, that the human is the expectation of attachment.
Absolutely.
So that we exist only in relation to having that attachment.
Well, how long would a baby survive without attachment?
It wouldn't.
Yeah. So the infant is an expectation, but not just for physical attachment, but also for emotional attachment of a nurturing and unconditional kind. We're an expectation for that. That's how we evolved as a species. The baby gorilla is an expectation to be loved, nurtured, held, and fed and protected by the mother gorilla. Now, have you ever seen a mother gorilla who ignores their baby's cries? Can you even imagine one? Have you seen a cat that ignores the little infant kitten's meow? Infant is an expectation for unconditional acceptance. We tell parents to ignore their babies crying. We tell parents to separate from their kids if the kids behave in a way that they don't like. We tell parents to deny children's natural need to play out there in nature. So human beings we evolved, as you say, as hominins over the last couple of million years. And as a species, the Homo sapiens, we evolved as expectations for certain conditions. The less a society meets those conditions, the more toxic it becomes to the developmental needs and therefore healthy growth of the human being.
Okay, so let's walk through that. So,
Yeah.
what do you do? Because you talk about needing to set boundaries, and you mentioned, look, I'm a parent, and at the end of the day, I do have
Yeah.
to set boundaries. So, how do we set a boundary without? And I'll quote. I think it was Plato or Aristotle that said this: the only impossible job is raising children. One of the reasons that I did not have kids is because my sister and I were raised in the same house by the same parents, and we reacted very differently to that.
But first of all, you're not brought up in the same home by the same parents.
That's interesting. Why do you say that?
Because the parent that the child experiences is the parent, the way they show up for that particular child. Your parents did not show up the same way for a female child as for a male child. Even if they tried to, they couldn't have, because they're programmed culturally not to. Secondly, you were different ages. You came along at different stages of their parent relationship to one another, or their self, or their relationship to themselves. You did not have the same parents. You did not grow up in the same house.
Yeah, that's
number one. Number
insightful.
two, you might have different sensibilities.
That is for sure.
One of you may be temperamentally more or less sensitive than the other. So that means even if your parents could have been the same, which they couldn't have been, but even if they could have been the same to both of you, you would have experienced them differently.
Okay, so knowing that level of complexity,
Yeah.
how do you do this well? Like it seems, so my mother disciplined me both physically, so I was spanked, and
Well, discipline. Sorry to interrupt, Tom.
no, please.
Discipline you is one way to put it. Hit you is another way to put it.
Yeah.
You know.
So, which that word doesn't ring weird to me, but I know, given your area of expertise, that it does for you. And that's what I'm trying to figure out. So how do we set a boundary without the child feeling that there are conditions around the love? Because reading that in your book, and again, I don't have kids, so nobody needs to panic, but unconditional love, to me, at an intellectual level anyway, doesn't seem to break just because you're told to sit on the stairs or be isolated.
Well, you see, the love that the child experiences. See, I don't doubt that your mother loved you, but the love that the child experiences is not what the parent feels. It's what the child gets from the parent. Now, if you're told that if you're angry, you need to be on your own, what message are you getting? You're getting the message that only under certain emotions only when certain emotions are present are you acceptable to the parent. The child will not experience that as love.
But that, so I will say this is purely anecdotal and it's just me, and I don't want to get lost in that.
Yeah.
But I remember, even as a kid, I would say that my mom, I sometimes get very angry at my mom, but I never doubt that she loves me.
No, nor should you doubt that she loved you, because she loved you. But that doesn't mean that you experience the love is unconditional. You wouldn't have any idea. You had nothing to compare it to. That's the only love you'd ever known.
So how do you set a boundary without breaking the sense of unconditional?
Okay, well, look, so that's the question of who's setting the boundary. You see.
Let's say a parent with...
No, but here's what I mean. With children who are naturally, lovingly connected to their parents, how you set a boundary is you say, don't do that. With a parent that the child is not totally unconditionally connected to, you have to use more and more force. So when you talk about setting boundaries, yes, you can't let a kid... I live in Vancouver, British Columbia. It's not Alaska, but we get pretty cold there. We get pretty cold there in the wintertime. A 1-year-old doesn't get a choice about, do I get to go outside naked into the winter in Vancouver? No choice. It's not a democracy. No, you don't go outside naked. But how I do that, a child who's wanting to attach to the parent warmly will naturally follow the parent's advice. You see, your mother hit you. Aboriginal people, hunter-gatherer people, don't hit their kids. When the Caucasians or the Europeans, the Christians, arrived in North America, they were appalled at the parenting practices of the natives because they didn't hit their kids. And yet those kids were far more confident and capable than the Caucasian kids. So that you can set boundaries through just love, through relationship, through example. It doesn't have to involve force, and certainly does not have to include physical force.
So that is one of the things that doesn't ring true to me. Now, I haven't studied it, so who knows? So maybe this is just because I've grown up in the system where it's sort of broken already from the jump. But is there anywhere where that experiment is being run today where we could see that? Because kids seem impulsive and their brains aren't developed and they just seem like little messes that need things like for instance, a kid that throws a tantrum because you won't let them go outside into the snow.
So why can't they throw a tantrum? They're expressing their anger.
Let's say.
But what were you saying before? Because I'm going to go back to it. Just before you talked about the tantrum. Oh yeah, kids are impulsive. Here's the thing. Children want to belong to the parent. They want to connect to the parent. There's a natural range of attachment behaviors that the kid will go through under healthy circumstances. One of them, first of all, is they want to be physically near you. They want to be held by you. In fact, Aboriginal people carry their kids everywhere they go. That's what they do. Gorillas carry their kids everywhere they go, spontaneously. Number one. Number two, the child wants to emulate you. They want to be like you. That's a natural attachment drive. So if you show up as a loving, nurturing parental figure, the kid will naturally want to emulate you and copy you. Number three, the child will want to be good for you without any coercion whatsoever. And again, I'm telling you, hunter-gatherer groups have been studied extensively for how they parent. And there's even books are being written now about trying to learn the lessons that they teach about how to parent. Why? Because we've lost our parenting instincts. You're talking like an adult without parenting instincts. And that's not a criticism. I'm just saying that when you're treated like the way you're treated, some ways I was treated, I talk in the book about it. Look, let me just jump back a little bit. This is in the book. I'm 2 weeks old. I'm still in the hospital with my mother. And she writes her diary. My poor little son, my heart breaks for you because you've been crying for the last hour and a half to be fed. But I don't feed you because I promised the doctor that I will only feed you on schedule. Now what's happening to me? This woman loves me. My mother desperately loved me. I know that in so many ways. But she's not listening to her own parenting instincts. Her heart is breaking, but she's letting me cry by myself because she promised some stupid doctor that she'd only feed me on schedule. What message am I getting? Am I getting the message that I'm being loved? Or as a 2-week-old, I'm getting the message that my needs don't matter and they don't care about how I feel? Which message am I getting? Yes, she totally loved me, but she wasn't listening to her own parenting instincts. And that is traumatic for the child. And it's confusing because she loves me, yet she doesn't even feed me when I'm hungry. Well, that's really confusing and it's traumatizing. And we're telling this to parents all the time in this society. As a physician, I used to tell parents to behave that way. I regret that, but I did. So what I'm talking about is a culture that has lost contact with the parenting instinct. Or take the example of, do you remember Dr. Spock? Yeah. So Dr. Spock was the world's parenting expert for decades. And he talked about how you deal with kids. You put them to sleep, you put them to bed, and you walk out quietly, and you close the door, and you don't go back in. Because you don't give in to the tyranny of the infant, he said. The tyranny of the infant. The infant has an attachment drive that says, I need to be held by mommy or daddy. The child is crying to express that attachment need. Because physically, that's how they can attach. They can't emotionally connect as a 1 month old. They can connect if you hold them, if they see you, if they hear you. What message are you giving to the kid when you don't pick them up when they're crying? That their feelings don't matter, that they don't matter. That's the message you're giving. You may love them, but you're still giving them a very negative message. And so that you may know on some level that your parent loves you because they feed you, they hug you, they whatever. But at the same time, these people that love you are deeply hurting you. That's traumatic. Aboriginal peoples don't do that kind of stuff under normal circumstances. They just don't do it.
Do they have a rite of passage moment where, so
let me do it again, sorry.
please.
The spanking business?
Yep.
There's been studies recently published in the American Journal, the Journal of the American Medical Association's Pediatrics publication, that kids who are spanked experience as much trauma as kids who are more severely abused. That's what the findings are in the long term. Sorry to interrupt, but I
No,
yeah.
not at all.
Yeah.
This topic is incredibly meaningful for anybody considering having kids, raising kids.
Yeah.
And certainly even for me, somebody that doesn't have kids nor plan to have kids, it is the thesis of your book is so big and so powerful that what it does though is okay, so I've grown up in a culture, your hypothesis, I've grown up in a culture that is fundamentally sick, is stopping many, many things. The book is way bigger than just parenting. We just happen to be on that right now. But so it's created sort of parents that are detached from their parental instincts.
That's right.
And so they're constantly making these mistakes, but it feels normal, right? So I grew up in it too. The fish is the last one to recognize what water is.
Yeah.
And so I can't even see that there could be another way of doing this.
Right.
But because of that, when I look at this, I think, once you're in the cycle, how do you break out of it? Because you can't be an infant forever. Even, gorillas, at some point, like the child is distanced from the parents, needs to be. Either they break away themselves or they get pushed away.
Or the parents may die.
Also very possible.
Yeah.
And in the cultures that I have unintentionally encountered rites of passage rituals, because I'm interested in rites of passage, there's this moment, but I don't. So the one I'll talk to specifically, because I remember it so vividly, is in The Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela's book. He talks about how, I think it was your 14th birthday, you're with the woman and your mother, and then you are ceremoniously removed from her physically, like they come and grab you and take you away.
At what age?
I think it was 14.
Okay.
And they take you away, and then there is this, they cover you in mud, and then you are, actually I think before you get covered in mud, I'm getting the order wrong here, but anyway, they sit you down buck naked in front of the whole tribe with a very sharp rock. They cut your foreskin off and they make you yell a warrior prayer, and then they cover you in mud, and then another young woman comes in after some time, washes the mud off your body. I mean, it was this whole thing. And before reading your work, I was like, that's so rad, like this rite of passage, that's dope. You're taking the child away from the mother. Is that a necessary moment? Or is that all part of this, like, just sort of crazy detachment from what we should be doing?
So I think it's a mix of both. Let's just step back a little bit. Nature has a natural agenda for every human being. Like, when you plant an acorn, what's nature's agenda for that acorn?
Grow into a tree.
Grow up to be an oak tree. So nature has the same agenda for human beings, to grow up to be independent, self-mastered, collective, connected beings. That's nature's agenda. That's how we evolved. But that means if you meet the right developmental conditions, that kid will grow up to be an independent person. Not because you push them away, but because that's nature's agenda. Because the parents are going to die at some point or another. So at some point or another, that infant has to be an independent adult. That's nature's agenda. We don't have to make that happen. That happens spontaneously so long as the conditions are right. Now, if you plant that acorn into dry ground with no irrigation and no sunlight, ain't going to be any oak tree. Not because the acorn doesn't have that capacity, but because the conditions weren't right. Same with human beings. So I'm saying,
what is up, my friend? Tom Bilyeu here, and I have a big question to ask you. How would you rate your level of personal discipline on a scale of 1 to 10? If your answer is anything less than a 10, I've got something cool for you. And let me tell you right now, discipline by its very nature, means compelling yourself to do difficult things that are stressful, boring, which is what kills most people, or possibly scary or even painful. Now, here is the thing. Achieving huge goals and stretching to reach your potential requires you to do those challenging, stressful things and to stick with them even when it gets boring, and it will get boring. Building your levels of personal discipline is not easy, but let me tell you, it pays off. In fact, I will tell you, you're never going to achieve anything meaningful unless you develop discipline. All right, I've just released a class from Impact Theory University called How to Build Ironclad Discipline that teaches you the process of building yourself up in this area so that you can push yourself to do the hard things that greatness is going to require of you. All right, click the link on the screen, register for this class right now, and let's get to work. I will see you inside this workshop from Impact Theory University. Until then, my friends, be legendary. Peace out.
If the conditions are right, that independence will happen anyway. Now, it's true. Societies have developed rituals of passage. So there's a Jewish bar mitzvah ceremony, which happens at age 13. You know, there's a vision quest that indigenous people will lead, you know, but those ritual rites of passages, or those rites of passage rituals, are conducted by adults to welcome the child into the adult community. In our original environments, which is small band hunter groups, there wasn't circumcision. In fact, I quote an expert on Aboriginal, indigenous, or hunter-gatherer groups, Dr. Darnassia Narvez of Notre Dame University, who says that circumcision wasn't a part of that kind of practice. So that circumcision came along later with more settled tribes and agriculture and so on. So once you get away from the hunter-gatherer milieu, we're getting more and more, or less and less natural. So what Mandela is describing then is a combination of a healthy rite of passage, of we're recognizing your adulthood now, we're honoring you, welcoming you to the community of adults. But there was also an element of barbarism in it, where you're deliberately hurting a child, for which there's no reason whatsoever, whether it's a male child or it's a female child. And we know to what degree female children in some areas of the world are hurt by the rituals of circumcision. The male children are hurt as well, not to the same degree as the females. But those are already post hunter-gatherer additions. So yes, rite of passage, beautiful. Why is it necessary to hurt somebody? It's not.
Hiding in there, and I'm so curious, I'm so glad that I get to ask you directly. Hiding in there sounds like to me a vision of humanity that is just loving and wonderful, and that our natural state is we would grow into the oak tree. That isn't my same base assumption, but you very much have an expertise that I lack. So does your worldview require that belief about humans to be not purely good, but certainly default good?
No, nobody's default good. We've always had problems as human beings because we're flawed beings, you know. But it's a question again of what develops under what conditions, you know. And the more our needs are met, the more, like for example, in this society, the belief very much is that we're competitive, aggressive, even hostile, selfish creatures. That's not how humanity developed. We could never have developed if that's the way we were. We could only have developed if they were nurturing and communal support and connection. And so if you look at all kinds of cultures that are so-called primitive, giving and receiving and connection are values. And people gain wealth by giving, not by gathering and taking from others. So wealth is defined as a set of social connections rather than a set of physical possessions. In Canada, in the Northwest, Pacific Northwest, they used to have the potlatch. And the potlatch do you know what a potlatch is?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's an event where people gather and they give gifts, which is how they gather wealth of connections. That's a very different sense of wealth than gathering everything onto myself by taking it away from everybody else. One of the first things that the colonialists did is they forbade the rituals and the spiritual ways of the indigenous people, including the potlatch, because it threatened the colonialist acquisitive ethic. So we went against thousands of years of tradition in order to force people into a cultural mindset that suited the purpose of colonialism. And that's what happened.
Okay, so going back to the idea of it doesn't require humans to be perfect. We're an imperfect creature. So if we are imperfect, and do you agree with, I think it was Solzhenitsyn who said that the evil runs through, or the line between good and evil runs through the heart of every man, which rings true to me. Does that ring true to you?
I would say that the potential for both runs through every person. Hitler was a human being. I say this in the book. Jesus was a human being. At least let's agree that in his earthly manifestation, whether you're a Christian, he was a human being. Even Jesus was tempted, wasn't he? You know, he's in the desert and is tempted by power and ego and acquisition. The Buddha, in the Buddha story, he's tempted by lust and by greed and by aggression and egotism. So yes, the potential for that kind of egotistical self-regard, which turns out to be evil at its ultimate expression, is that strain is in us. So is the strain for compassion like the Buddha, infinite love like Jesus, humility like Moses. That's all within us as well. The question is, which conditions promote which in its development? The Buddhist talks about seeds, of which seeds in our minds are planted and which get watered and which don't. So, yes, I agree that the potentials are there, and in an embryo everything is there, but the question is what gets nourished and what gets suppressed. And I'm saying that in this society, it's the worst of us that gets nourished and the best of us that gets suppressed.
All right, so let's define those. What I would assume that loving attachment, unconditionally loving attachment, certainly towards your children, that's part of the best of us. What are some other attributes of the best? And then we'll move on to some of the worst.
So let's talk about children, and then let's talk about people in general. So children's needs are unconditional loving acceptance.
From everyone or just their parents?
Well, their parents, or well, ideally from the community, but certainly they're nurturing caregivers, whoever they are, and they're meant to be more than just a parent, by the way. We're never meant to be parented in nuclear families. Okay, it's pure, that's a modern thing. So unconditional loving acceptance, rest from having to work to make the relationship work.
Say that again?
Rest from having to work to make the relationship work. In other words, the child should not have to mold themselves into anything to make the relationship work with the parents. They shouldn't have to work. They shouldn't have to be good, nice, pretty to make the relationship work. They shouldn't have to take care of the parents' emotional needs to make the relationship work. Like people that have to work to meet their parents' emotional needs end up in deep trouble as adults, very often physically ill.
You go into tremendous detail in the book about that.
So children should be able to allow to feel all their emotions. And I mentioned play before. Those are the needs of the child. As human beings more generally, we need a sense of connection, a sense of meaning, a sense of belonging, a sense of transcendence, so that there's something, we're part of something greater than just our little egoic concerns. These are all the needs of human beings. To the extent that they're met, we thrive. To the extent that they're not met, we shrivel. And there's lots of shriveled people in positions of great power in this society.
No doubt. Okay, so what are the, as we're creating this soil that we're going to nurture things in, how do things start to go awry, and how do we begin to prep the soil for something better?
Well, we've covered that to some degree. So things will begin to go awry when we lose contact with our parenting instincts, and we.
Is it just that? Like, is this? Would you? Speaking from experience, the book
Yeah.
is very broad. But if you were going to really like bring it down, is this largely an echo of a parenting system that has become dysfunctional?
It's a society that's become humanly dysfunctional that transmits its expectations through the parents. And that actually begins before birth. Because already the more stressed and troubled the parents are, that has a physiological impact on the child's brain development. So I'm just talking pure science here. So mothers who are stressed and depressed, their infants in the womb are already getting those messages hormonally and through nerve conduction and so on, so that you can actually monitor the heart rates of mothers who are stressed, and those heart rates will be different than the heart rates of infants whose mothers are not stressed.
In the book, you talk about the crazy ice storm
Yeah.
that ends up showing up in the epigenetic markers of kids. If you don't mind, walk us through that. It's pretty crazy.
Well, it's only that in the laboratory they've shown that the more you stress parent animals, the more troubled and stressed the kids will be. So in Quebec, there was an ice storm some years ago, and the parents the mothers underwent great stress, and it's really cold. There was no heating. A lot of stuff wasn't working. Those mothers who experienced that stress, their children were shown to have more troubles later on, behaviorally and learning-wise, and in other ways as well. So again, the stresses of the parent translate into the physiology of the child. There's a study that I quoted in the book about. They looked at marriages that were stressed, and you could. There's two ways you could tell how stressed the marriage was. One is you could ask the parents, and they would talk about it. The other way is you could measure the urinary stress hormone levels of their children.
Wow.
And the parental conflict was reflected in elevated stress hormone levels in the urine of the children. Now, elevated stress hormone levels in the urine means that the immune system itself is under assault. And that has an implication for health later on. We know, for example, that the more stressed parents are, the greater the risk of asthma for their children. And that the degree of stress on the parents is correlated with the amount of medication a kid will need for their asthma. Amongst other studies, lots of such studies. So in other words, there's a correlation between the emotional environment that we grow up in and our physiology.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the core thrust of the book is, hey, all these things that you think are maybe just old age or bad diet, they're actually related to trauma or even disease. In fact, one of the ones you talk about that was the most eye-opening was ALS, which, I would think of as a genetic disease, bummer, horrible roll of the dice. But walk people through there is a predictable personality trait of people with ALS that I was like, what?
Well, so first of all, there's nothing genetic about ALS. Nobody's ever shown. I mean, there might be some rare examples of ALS genetically induced, but those would be a tiny, infinitely small minority. So genes don't have much to do with most chronic illnesses. There are some illnesses that are genetic. There's the one that runs in my family. My mother and my aunt had it, muscular dystrophy. Gradually, they became weaker and weaker. Already when I was a child, my mother couldn't lift her arm up. And in the end, she was not mobile at all. And so if you get that gene, you're going to get the disease. But those diseases are very, very rare, about 1 in 10,000. Most chronic illnesses have very little or no genetic basis to it. So, for example, there's a breast cancer gene, but out of 100 women with breast cancer, only 7 will have the gene. And out of 100 women with the gene, not all of them will get the cancer. So in many cases, even if these genes are implicated, it's the interaction of genes and environment. Now in ALS, the ALS personality, which I noticed in palliative care when I was a palliative care physician, also in the literature, are people that repress their healthy anger, are emotionally very rigid, and they don't ask for help from anybody. And usually that's based on childhood trauma. And Lou Gehrig was like that.
Can you define trauma? You go to very careful lengths in the book to make sure that people understand trauma isn't always getting hit with a bat or being sexually abused. Like there's a range that can be wildly impactful.
Well, let's take Lou Gehrig, after whom the disease is named in North America. His father was an alcoholic, and Lou Gehrig was one of these really nice guys that took care of his mother emotionally. He had to. That's what happens in the home of an alcoholic. Very often the child becomes the caregiver. Now, he was such a nice guy that, you know, the record that he set for consecutive games played, that stood for so many decades. Why did he set that record? Because even if he was sick, he would play. Because he's too dutiful to his teammates to take himself out of a game. Is that a healthy thing or not? It's not healthy. On the other hand, when there was a young rookie on the Yankees who got sick and he couldn't play, and the manager was very upset with this kid, Gehrig says, "What are you talking about? He's sick, he can't play." Took the rookie to his own home, where he lived with his mother. His mother put the kid to bed, the rookie, nursed him, and Lou Gehrig slept on the couch. So that kind of self-sacrificing, self-negating, emotionally repressed, really nice person is the person which is typical of the ALS personality. And there's been a whole lot of studies on that show that, you know, these are the people that get ALS. It's just that the doctors don't make the link between that personality pattern and the ALS. They just
basically swallowing your anger.
Swallowing your healthy anger.
Swallowing your healthy anger is directly causative to ALS?
I think it's a major contributor. You never see it. You never see it. You never see the healthy anger in anybody with ALS. And you always see this hyper-conscientious, hyper-autonomous self-sufficiency that, no, I don't need any help. No. And when you talk to neurologists, which has been done in studies, they always describe their patients as extraordinarily nice. ALS patients, extraordinarily nice. Why are they so nice? Because they repress their healthy aggression. It's just that the neurologists don't make the link between that and the disease. I'm saying that plays a major role, because that repression of emotions, again, the emotions are not separable from our physiology. The nervous system and the immune system and hormonal apparatus and the gut and the heart, they're all one system. When something happens in one area, something happens in the other area as well. Look, the analogy in the book is this. Think of a person with a big beach ball trying to push a beach ball under the water. That takes a lot of effort. Now, have you ever been angry?
Of course.
Okay. Now, when you're angry, it's not just an emotional state in your head, it's your whole body is. Now, how much energy would it take to suppress that energy, to suppress that anger? Can you imagine? So that you don't even feel it? But not feeling your anger was an adaptation to your childhood, where the anger wasn't permitted. So that emotional, physiological effort of repressing anger takes a toll on the nervous system and on the immune system. It's a major role in disease. I'm saying, it plays a major contribution.
Yeah, this is where the book really starts to get into some fascinating territory as you go through all these different diseases and you start talking about, okay, repressing anger. You go into the natural killer T cells end up being suppressed because you're putting so much energy away from your immune system. Your immune system can't keep up. And so there's all kinds of things like cancer that are afflicted. There was one thing where you said, like, back in the 1800s or early 1900s, there was a doctor that was like, oh, whenever you see somebody with heart disease, they have this type of personality. Yeah. And you even talk about in the book the type C. You said it's not a personality type, but that there are traits that people with type C have that end up being sort of pro-disease personality traits.
Yeah.
What are some of those traits?
Well, before I answer
Start
that, let me go back to something. Let's talk about healthy anger for a minute, if you could. Okay. Then I'll illustrate these traits. Okay. What is healthy anger? Why are we given healthy anger? So there's a system in our brain for anger. Not just for us, mammals. What is it there for? It's there to protect our boundaries. Somebody invades your space, physically, or in the case of human beings, emotionally, used to say, "No, stay out." That's the role of healthy anger. Now, if I repressed that healthy anger, what would happen to me in life? People would be just trespassing all over me all the time because I had no boundaries. So healthy anger is a boundary defense. Is that clear?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Healthy anger is a boundary defense. It just says...
Seems like one of its uses, I'll be honest. I don't know that I'd say it's its only use, but I don't know if that
healthy
matters.
anger, that's its only use. That's its major use.
Just boundary protection.
That's its major... That's why it came along. Animals have it. You're in my space. Get out.
How far are you extending that to loved ones? So now if you encroach upon a loved one...
Well, if your loved one intrudes your space emotionally...
No, I mean if somebody else is intruding on my loved one.
Oh, yeah, that too.
in
Yeah,
some
yeah.
way.
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's you or your loved ones, anything you cherish. Absolutely, for sure. So that's healthy anger. So the role of anger is to set a boundary between what's nourishing, to let in. The role of healthy anger is to keep out what's dangerous and unwelcome, right? What's the role of the emotional system in general? Is to let in what's healthy and nurturing and to keep out what's dangerous and unwelcome. Is that fair enough?
Seems good.
What's the role of the immune system?
Same, basically.
Exactly. It's the same. The role of the immune system is to keep out what's dangerous and toxic, allowing what's nourishing and healthy. The immune system and the emotional system are not separate systems. They're part and parcel of the same apparatus. They're unified. When you suppress the emotions, you're also suppressing the immune system. When you
Tom Bilyeu here, announcing my new Espanol episodes on YouTube and podcast. We are committed to spreading the impact theory message of empowerment at scale to as many people in our growing global community as possible. So we've taken some of our best IT episodes with some amazing guests and dubbed them into Spanish language. Tell your friends and family, start watching Tom Bilyeu en Espanol. Muchas gracias. Be legendary.
when you don't know how to defend your emotional boundaries, that also weakens your immune boundaries physiologically. It's that simple. Or if you repress the anger, that anger doesn't go away, doesn't evaporate into the heavens, it turns against you in the form of depression or self-loathing and so on. In the same way, the immune system turns against you, and now you have autoimmune disease. And so the traits that were identified with chronic illness, most chronic illness like cancers or autoimmune disease, are emotional self-suppression, inability to experience healthy anger, desire to please others, to fit in, to be acceptable, to be nice, to be ignoring of your own needs. These are the traits that are over and over and again identified in the literature, whether with multiple sclerosis or rheumatoid arthritis or with cancer. Now, these are not the real person. These are adaptive traits in response to the childhood environment, but they take a heavy toll. Or take another so-called illness. And by the way, the case I'm making is that what we call illness is actually response to life. So take depression, this so-called biological disease of the brain. What does it mean to depress something?
Try to push it down.
To push it down. What's get pushed on in depression? Well, I can tell you, I've been depressed. What gets pushed on depression is your natural emotions. Everything is flat, and nothing matters, nothing has any meaning.
And that starts with people pushing them down?
That's the word. That's what the word means. It means to push it down. It starts in childhood with people having to push down their emotions. Why do they have to push down their emotions? To fit in with other people's expectations.
So, and I don't know the literature on this at all. So there, oftentimes then the depression will just sort of creep in slowly. I always assumed it was tied to something, being stuck in a bad relationship, a death in the family, loss of a job, that there would be some sort of triggering event.
Well, okay, fair enough. If you're in a bad relationship, the healthy response is not depression, but to deal with the challenges in the relationship, either by working them out or by leaving the relationship. Depression isn't a necessary outcome. The response to the death of a close one, is not depression, it's grief. Grief is the healthy response. We have a system in our brain for grief, by the way.
So grief becomes depression when you're not allowing yourself to grieve.
But you don't know how to grieve properly, yeah. And you don't know how to grieve properly because your emotions were suppressed as a child. And so, yeah, we have these healthy systems, but their activity gets deformed through our natural expectations.
Okay, so to stay with depression for a minute, so you're pushing all this stuff down. It starts in early childhood. You're trying to fit in. You want unconditional love. You're not getting it. So you have this directive for attachment. And so you begin to, I see what I can do. If I don't yell, scream, if I'm not expressing frustration, if I'm the caretaker or whatever that situation demands, then all is well. So now I've learned this adaptive response to suppress my emotions. And over time, it begins to numb me, I would assume. I have not been depressed, so you're beginning to be numbed, but now starts to be very extreme, and what I have heard depression explained as is just like the skies are permanently gray. You will never see joy again. And so what is breaking in that like the beach ball analogy I like, right? I'm pushing something under the water, but if I stop pushing, it will pop back up. And so if that thing or my emotions is, when you're treating depression, let's say non-pharmacologically, is it the release of the pressure on those emotions to let them finally come up?
Yeah, so the difference between the pushing the beach ball down is that I'm doing it consciously and deliberately. But the repression of emotions that a child engages in is not conscious, is not deliberate. It's an automatic response. It's unconscious. Therefore, the child can't just let go like that. And then, as you say, it numbs and becomes overall a depression. Now, by the way, I'm not against pharmacological treatment. I've taken antidepressants. They have helped me. So I'm not here to advocate against them. I could talk about their misuse, but in principle, sometimes they're helpful, and occasionally they're life-saving. And much of the time, they're overprescribed for way too long, and we're not dealing with the real issues, because the pharmacology deals with the symptom, but it doesn't deal with the underlying problem. So yes, the healing of depression, and I talk, the final part, and the longest part of the book really is on healing, is you have to reconnect to yourself so you can feel your emotions. That's the treatment of depression.
Talk to me about reconnecting. How do you reconnect? What is that process?
Well, first of all, you recognize that you're disconnected. And you notice how that disconnect shows up in so many areas of your life. On the job, or in your personal relationships, for example, or in your relationship to yourself. So you have to become aware. And this is where I talk about disease, whether it's physical or so-called mental, as teacher. Not that I recommend illness as a way of learning to anybody. It's not my preferred.
But if it happens.
But if it happens, it can actually teach you. And you can ask yourself, what have you been pushing down? And what are the stories? Why do I push it down? Oh, I pushed on emotions because I've learned, I have the belief that if I'm angry, I'm a bad person. Well, is that really true? Is a person that experiences anger really a bad person? I learned that if I push down my needs, then people will love me. Do I really want to be loved at the expense of disconnecting from myself? As a child, I had no choice, because I had to be loved or connected with, otherwise I wouldn't have survived. Is it still like that? So basically, it's a gradual.
Isn't it though?
Sorry?
Isn't it like, in fact, this is my overarching question, and as somebody that has helped so many people through therapy, you probably have the answer or an insight. But as we become adults, you don't have like, other than your parents, should you be lucky enough that they're still alive. But man, out in the outside world, people do want you to act a certain way. And if you don't, they're not going to be around you. Like, I'll just be honest. If somebody's throwing a tantrum as an adult, I don't have time for that.
But an adult doesn't throw a tantrum.
Are you sure?
Yeah.
Like, I have seen adults throw what I would call the adult version of a tantrum.
You have children in adult bodies throw tantrums.
Interesting. Okay, go on.
You know, so the adult who throws a tantrum, he's a traumatized child who has not developed self-regulation. I'm not talking about repression of self, but regulation. So, for example...
Help me differentiate.
So, for example, I throw up at the airline counter, and they've overbooked the airplane, okay? My healthy response is disappointment and some degree of anger. I'd say, this is not right that you did this. I want you to redress it. You do something about it, please. Throwing a tantrum. Yelling at the poor clerk behind the counter who had nothing to do with creating the problem, who's just trying to do her job and trying to help me as best she can. That's not a mature adult. That's a child whose midfrontal cortex of self-regulation has gone offline and his emotional circuits have taken over. Believe me, I've been an adult child very often in my life, as my wife could tell you. So that's not an adult.
Okay, so then the process there goes back to connect to yourself, figure out why you're repressing this.
Yeah.
Let go of those things that are keeping it down. Find a way to be able to regulate yourself so that they're sort of contextually sensical, so that we're not in unhealthy anger territory. Okay, interesting.
So trauma is an imprint that makes you react to the present like you're still a child. Essentially, I mean, that's a very narrow definition of trauma, but that's one of its essential aspects.
And that the important thing that you said earlier is it's automatic.
It's automatic. It's unwilled. It's automatic, and it's and actually, when you look at the brain scans of deeply traumatized people, the prefrontal cortex is totally asleep, and the emotional circuits, you know, they're the primitive emotional responses are active. This is why so much of the jail population are traumatized people. That's why they end up in jail. But instead of dealing with their trauma and helping them develop, which they could, under the right circumstances, become adult people, self-regulated, the jails just make it worse by the way they torment people and the way they traumatize people even further. So when I talk about a trauma-informed society, what if we actually understood trauma? What if we just actually understood it? It would have huge implications for medical school, for medical health delivery. What if when you went to the doctor with your depression, you weren't just told, you got this biological disease of the brain, here's a pill. But they actually said, what happened to you as a child? One of the people I quote in the book is the great pediatrician, psychiatrist, neuroscientist Bruce Perry, who just wrote a book with Oprah, the title of which is called What Happened to You? Not what's wrong with you, what happened to you? What if we asked that question? You know, so that would change medical treatment completely. What if in the prison system or in the legal system, we didn't just say, what did you do? But what happened to you that made you do it? Now that wouldn't mean that we allow or encourage antisocial behavior, but it would mean that we would actually want to rehabilitate people and to help them become who they could be. You know, that's a very different legal concept. What if in education, it was kids' developmental needs that were put paramount rather than their performance?
It's interesting. How would you do that functionally? What would school look like?
Well, I talk about it a bit. Like schools in Finland, there's much more play. There's much more freedom. And they have much better results than we do. So that, in other words, we honor
What are the right results to look at?
a child who's curious, who wants to learn, who's engaged, who's respectful of others, who is confident. That would be the right results. Then you don't have to worry about stuffing knowledge down their throats. Why? Because they want to learn. They want to learn. So you don't have to punish them, you don't have to reward them. You just present them with the opportunities to learn, and they will. That's a natural human attribute. We kill that in this society.
And how much of that, like, and again, I am so aware that I come at the interpretation of your solutions as somebody sort of in the thick of the broken thing.
Yeah.
I used to teach adults, so very different than teaching, 12-year-olds or whatever. But there is a certain amount of like, hey, I need everybody to stop talking and pay attention, right? So how do you create the system where we want a totally different outcome? So we're not going to be judging just based on your math. We're going to be looking at inquisitiveness. We're going to be looking at how much that you want to learn, but you're dealing with large groups, people in all different kinds of positions. Like, how do we, because the punchline of your book is like, basically, hey, we're going to have to overhaul a lot of this.
Yeah.
I mean, you go very specifically into the ways in which the culture is toxic. You have to read the book to get into it. But it is like, in a nutshell, is basically, we're sort of like, this is a ground up restart. Like, there is a fundamental flaw. We've already talked about the sort of basic first building block of how you actually, in fact, we haven't, because in the book you talk about, like, even before you get pregnant, the things that can create trauma in a fetus, and it's carried on. And look, I will tell you, dear audience, that he talks about the science, and there really is, from what I've seen, quite a bit of science that can show, I think it was up to 5 generations, you could see an epigenetic marker of trauma in even the father who's carrying that across the sperm into the fertilized egg. It has an impact on how the DNA is wrapped and expressed. It's insane. And that it goes for 5 generations. That's madness. And you begin to realize how easy it is to perpetuate this sort of wheel of trauma. So knowing that, there's probably 2 things we should talk about, because right now, if mothers are paying attention, they're freaking out about all the mistakes that they made that have now traumatized their children. And so you go into blame in the book. I think that's important to touch on. And then
go into the importance of not blaming.
Exactly. So I want you to speak to the role of blame here. And then how do we begin to heal, stroke, build a society that isn't sick?
Well, the good news is that I wrote this book with my eldest son. I mean, and believe me, I've had a lot of guilt as a parent. I felt a lot of guilt for the way that I stressed and passed on my own trauma to my children, which I did. Not because I wanted to, I loved them. As I've always said, I would have thrown myself into a fire for them. But there was a problem. They never needed me to throw myself into a fire. They just needed me to be at home, self-regulated, knowing how to take care of myself, and knowing how to attune with their needs. Now that, as a traumatized survivor of the genocide in Europe, and as a workaholic doctor, and as an anxious husband in a conflictual marriage, I wasn't able to do. And that really did hurt my kids. I say that at this point, not with guilt, just to say that's what happened. I know I did my best. That just happened to be my best. But anyway, what I'm saying is that I wrote this book with my son, and even the writing was a process of working out our issues. So the first thing, though, is that these issues can always be worked out, that the patterns can be reversed. We don't have to stay stuck in them. So that's the good news. As far as blame is concerned, as you say, trauma is passed on multi-generationally. You know, the Bible says that the sins of the fathers will be visited on to the 3rd and 4th generations. They're not talking about the sins of the fathers, they're talking about the traumas of the parents will be passed on to the future generations. It's true. But if that's true, if I passed on my trauma to my kids, did I cause my own trauma as a child? Why would anybody be blamed? Who you end up blaming? Adam and Eve? You know, you end up blaming some ape living in a tree who was my ancestor at some point. I mean, blame doesn't make any sense. It's also cruel and totally unhelpful. So there's no blame. In fact, it's not about blaming, it's about understanding. But once we understand, now we can start to do things differently. That's the whole point. It's not about blaming.
So we have to break the cycle, self-awareness, get in touch with ourselves. Now let's zoom out a little bit. So we know what to do on an individual basis. We have to stop the repression, let the emotions come up, mature into the adult that has the ability to self-regulate, that could be there for the next generation to raise a child in a healthier way.
Exactly.
At a societal level, how do we begin to think about this? And what are some highlights of like the things that you're like, yo, this is really broken and causing a lot of problems? Is it the healthcare system? Is it the education system? Like, where do you think sort of the real big ones are?
Well, the healthcare system and educational system, in any given society, the dominant institutions will reflect the interests of the dominant groups in any society. So who are the dominant groups in this society? Here's what we know. I know I'm talking to somebody who's made a lot of money, okay? So don't take this personally. but the dominant groups in this society are getting wealthier and wealthier and wealthier, and the rest of society is getting more and more uncertain and insecure. That's an untenable situation. Because when you look at what stresses people are loss of control, uncertainty, conflict, and lack of information, which are precisely the conditions that most people are increasingly living with. There's less security, there's less sense of a positive future, there's more sense of loss of control, there's more sense that I'm a little voice, I don't matter. Even during COVID, when a lot of people lost a lot of money and under terrific economic stress, the top stratum of billionaires gained immensely. Well, that's a stressful situation for a lot of people. That stress translates into physiological illness. That's just how it works. That's the first point. Uncertainty, loss of control, conflict, lack of information. That's a given condition of globalized capitalism. Because you never know when somebody a zillion miles away is going to make a decision that's going to change your life completely, over which you have no control whatsoever. That's a designation, or that's a recipe for stress. Okay, number one. Number two, you look at, well, there's a chapter on sociopathy as strategy. Now, you look at corporations, major corporations, who make decisions to deliberately concoct products that'll get people hooked and addicted. I'm talking about the food companies. This has been documented, that they actually plan scientifically which combination of salt, sugar, and fat are going to get people addicted, which are going to excite the addictive circuits in the brain.
No doubt.
Thereby killing millions of people. The tobacco companies, do I have to talk about them at all? About what they've done? The companies that have for decades hired phony scientists to deny climate change, thereby creating conditions of ill health, endangering life itself. And these are respectable, well-to-do pillars of society and philanthropists on massive scale. The pharmaceutical companies who sell opiates knowing. Now, I'm not against opiates, by the way. As a palliative care doctor, I love the opiates, not for myself, but for the patients I was looking after. Thank God. But to sell those products and telling doctors that they're not addictive when you know that they are, tens and hundreds of thousands of people are dying of opioid overdoses. Well, that's sociopathy by any definition. And these are the people at the top.
Still an echo of childhood trauma, or do you think there's something else at play?
Well, it's a combination. I think the people who do it, they're really disconnected from themselves. They really are disconnected from themselves. And they're acting out their traumas in some ways. But it's also the nature of this system. These are the people that this system raises to high levels of power and rewards. Then there's the political system. Now, I'm not talking about political policy here for a moment, but in the book, in the chapter on trauma and politics, we looked at two opposing candidates, Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Now, Trump is one of the world's trauma experts. Bessel van der Kolk said to me, is a poster boy for trauma. The grandiosity, the denial of reality, the genuine inability to tell reality from lies, the aggressiveness. Trump said once that the world is a horrible place. It's dog eat dog. Even your friends want your wife, they want your money, they want your house. And this is your friends. Now, he wasn't making it up. That sense of the world being a horrible place reflected his childhood under a tyrant of a father who demeaned his kids horribly, and a mother who didn't protect them, and one of his brothers drank himself to death. Now, as we know, his niece wrote a book, who knows the family really well, on the trauma that Trump endured and how it manifests in his adult life. Now, I'm not criticizing the guy, I'm not blaming him, I'm not even talking about his specific policies, I'm talking about his personality. Now, that's Trump, okay? Who was he running against? So, let me tell you this story. You probably read it, but let me tell it to you and give me your opinion. A 4-year-old girl runs into the house to his mother. She's upset because neighborhood children are bullying her. And the mother says, there's no room for cards in this house. Now you get out there and deal with it. What's the message to that child?
At 4 years old,
Yeah.
at 4 years old, how would that be read? That you're on your own, kid.
Yeah, you suck it up. And don't be vulnerable in this house. That story was told at Hillary Clinton's nomination celebration at the Democratic convention in 2016. And it was told as an example of wonderful parenting. That same election campaign, when Hillary developed pneumonia, what did she do with it? Do you remember?
Nothing, right?
She didn't tell anybody.
Yeah.
She collapsed in the street. She sucked it up. And she put up, of course, with the philandering of her husband all those years, blaming herself for not meeting his needs. Typical trauma response. What I'm saying is that the American public had the choice between two traumatized people. They chose the more traumatized one.
The more traumatized.
Yeah.
That's
the one. That's the one they chose. There were all kinds of reasons for that. Again, I'm not talking about policy, foreign or domestic. I'm talking about personalities here. These are the people that we elevate to public, high public level, and they carry their traumas with them. See, trauma, as I define it, is not about what happens to us. It's about what happens inside of us as a result of what happens to us. And so the wound in trauma means wound. So the wound in this case is my sense of deficiency or not being good enough, not being worthy enough. Once I realize that, this has got nothing to do with anything except this interpretation that I made of my own experience all those years ago, then when I notice it, I can no longer believe it. I don't have to any longer be a subject to that interpretation of myself in the world. So awareness is one step. It's not adequate, but it's an essential step towards letting go.
That one belief that you weren't good enough.
Yeah.
How did that rear its ugly head throughout your life?
It made me a workaholic physician because I had to keep proving my worth. And it doesn't matter. Now, I don't know if you ever had an addiction, but the nature of it is that we're trying to get from the outside something that only can arise and fulfill us from the inside. So when you're looking at it from the outside, it's addictive because you get it temporarily, but then that internal emptiness, that hole, never goes away. So it has to be filled over and over and over again. It can only be done so temporarily. So it becomes runaway addictive. So then, work becomes an addiction because I keep trying to prove my worth. And it doesn't matter how many times, I may show up in a positive way at the beginning of someone's life, at the end of somebody else's life, or any time in between. It never fills that emptiness that my sense of lack of worthiness creates. So that's one way it shows up. Another way it shows up is if in my relationship, I don't feel as satisfied. My wife doesn't please me the way I like her to. Then I get angry. But why am I getting angry? I'm getting angry because it's my sense of not being good enough that's being now revealed. It gets uncovered, this self-accusation. But I get angry at her because her job is to make me not feel that. We get into this relationship for all kinds of reasons. Some of them are conscious, some are not. Some are positive, some are come out of trauma. And in my case, I want that relationship to prove to me how good I am. So when it isn't proving that, then I get upset at my partner, Well, except the gap is inside me, not inside. It's not coming from her. So it showed up in my parenting. It shows up all over the place.
I mean, I think both of those examples sound a lot like me, especially the first one.
Yeah.
The second one as well. But
in what sense?
In the sense that I'm definitely a workaholic. And I think in the earlier phases of my life, I sacrificed everything in this pursuit of becoming a millionaire and having all this stuff and really getting this validation. Sacrificed meaningful connections, everything in the pursuit of this one thing.
Well, part of the toxicity of the culture that I talk about in this book is that it actually rewards that kind of emptiness or that desperate seeking to fill that emptiness, because you get rewarded. You make a lot of money. A lot of people admire you. You get to feel good about yourself. Mind you, my guess is that good feeling is only temporary. At least if my example is any guide, that feeling good because somebody from the outside values you is only a temporary salve for the wound that's inside. But the world actually rewards it. So you're a workaholic doctor, great, you make more money, and all these people respect you. Meanwhile, you're hollowing yourself from the inside, and you're not available for your family. So that's part of the craziness of this culture.
And it's like the hedonistic treadmill in a sense, because you just never, enough is never enough, as you say.
Yeah.
So the last achievement needs to be surpassed by a greater achievement for me to get an applaud or a clap. I've never really made the connection that the reason why I'm a workaholic is because I am trying to prove to the world that I'm enough. But I think that it's entirely true.
Yeah. So in your case, like race and class in this society of inequality are certainly potentially traumatic inputs, as I pointed in this book, and to the degree that it affects people's physiology, But also then, I don't know your family of origin or what kind of relationship you have with your parents, but there also may have been a sense, like I got with my mom for reasons, and for whatever might have happened in your family, maybe you got the sense as well that even in your family of origin you weren't good enough somehow.
So my mum would scream at my dad for like 7 hours a day, and my dad would just sit there.
Okay.
And so my early memories of like looking at my mum and dad are this kind of violent verbally, not like physically, this incredibly stressful screaming, one person screaming at the other. Yeah. That's what I remember. But from reading what you've written in this book and from what you've said now, I actually might have learned that I was the problem to some degree.
Children interpret it that way. That's just the whole point. That's what I mean about kids being narcissists. I don't mean that in a negative sense. I mean, actually, they think it's all about them. So if your mother is unhappy, it's your fault. and you're not good enough. So then you have to go out there and work to prove to the world and to yourself that you're good enough. So that, going back to your first question about how these things show up in our lives, that's how they show up.
And so 12 years old, you emigrate to Vancouver.
Yeah.
By 28, you join the medical profession.
Yeah.
And you spend the next 32 years, roughly, working in medical practice?
At 28, I went back to medical school, actually. I took a detour. I was a high school teacher for a while. And then I was 27, 28 when I started medical school. At age 33, I think I began my medical career of 32 years.
And in those 33 years, what was your practice? What did you specialize in? What did you focus on?
So I was a family physician, which meant I delivered a lot of babies and I looked after people's problems from beginning to the end of life. I also worked in palliative care. I was the director of a unit at the hospital, which looked after people with terminal disease. And that was 22 years or so of my practice, 22 years. And then I switched gears altogether and I went to work in the downtown east side of Vancouver, British Columbia, which is North America's most concentrated area of drug use. We have more people coming from anywhere in the world are shocked by what they see there. Thousands of people in the streets injecting, selling, using, inhaling, ingesting drugs of all kinds, and people are suffer the consequences of drug use in a society that doesn't understand drug use, so it punishes it and excludes it, ostracizes it. So people get HIV from dirty needles and hepatitis C. So this is the population. Often they're homeless. So that's the population I worked with for 12 years till the end of my medical work.
That experience working with patients that were in palliative care.
Yeah.
So that's, for anybody that doesn't know, that's patients that are approaching the end of their life, that have terminal illnesses and that are aware that they're going to die. What did that experience teach you?
It took an acceptance of one's lack of omnipotence as a physician, because you go into you want to cure people, you want people to heal, and now it takes a tremendous acceptance to say, we've reached the limit of our knowledge, and that doesn't mean we can't help people, but we certainly can't cure them, And so it taught me how to be with the inevitable. And when you're working with people who are in the process of dying, by the way, who isn't in the process of dying, but people whose time is more limited than the rest of us. Acceptance, you learn a lot of acceptance. It challenges you to do your best when you know your best isn't going to be saving anybody's lives, but it's to help people live a life of as little suffering as possible and as much dignity as possible. So it really challenges the best parts of you to show up. Patience, acceptance, intuition. Personally, it taught me a lot to listen to people. Interesting enough, people really want to be heard when they're dying. They want to make sense of their lives. They want to tell their stories, then they want their stories to be heard. And so I listened a lot. I just sat by the bedside and I listened. All that.
When you listened, did you hear any themes relating to regret or things that actually mattered? Because I always imagine if I was given such news that my life was coming to an end and there was an approximate date, it would be quite a powerful way of finally realizing what truly matters and what never did.
People react to their impending death in different ways. So there were some people who just fought it to the end, they didn't really want to accept it. But most people were more along the lines that you described, where they really get to see what's important. And so I mentioned this a number of times. It sounds strange, and I don't recommend it. But I've had patients say to me, "Doctor, I don't know how to tell you this, and I can't even explain it perhaps, but this illness that's going to take my life is the best thing that ever happened to me." And what they meant a couple of things by it. They meant what you just said about finding out what's really important in life. In this book, The Myth of Normal, I interview a young man called Will Pye, who wrote a book called Blessed with a Brain Tumor. What kind of blessing is that? So I asked Will, what's the blessing? And he said, it made me appreciate every moment. It meant every time I talked to somebody, I knew this might be the last conversation I'm going to have with them. So it better be a human, genuine interaction. So there was that aspect of it. The other aspect of it was that, again, my view is, as I pointed in this book and in previous works, who gets sick and who doesn't isn't exactly accidental. There are certainly personality patterns based on traumatic experiences in childhood that make disease more likely. And people very often realize that throughout their lives, they had abandoned who they were. They lived a life that wasn't meaningful for them. And around death, they reconnected with themselves in an authentic way. And that seemed to be worth a lot to people. Again, I don't recommend that way of going, to reconnect with yourself, but people have I certainly saw it. So those are the two big lessons.
Because I remember reading in your book about the study with the rats.
Yeah.
And how could you tell me about that study, how the stress study with the rats, and how the parents' treatment of a child impacted their stress response, and then also they passed that on, which I thought was staggering.
Yeah, that was a very interesting study. It was done in Canada at McGill University. I think maybe sometime in the last 20 years, early 2000s, I think. And they looked at how mother rats interacted with their infants, their newborns. And there's this process called grooming, in which the mother rat licks the infant or in the perineal or perianal area, in the genitalia. This is shortly after birth. These mother rats just start licking their infants. Some mother rats did it in a more efficient and caring kind of way than other mother rats. Those that had the better kind of caring, the better kind of grooming, grew to be calmer and responded to stress in more functional ways than those little rats who, as neonates, had not been given that same kind of efficient and quite as caring grooming. And what they found that in the brains of those adult rats who had been groomed one way or the other as infants, the stress apparatus was different, certain receptors for the stress hormones. So one of them could calm themselves more easily than the other. What was interesting is, you might say, well, so what? That's just genetic. The calmer mothers passed on their genes to their infants. No, they didn't. Because if you took the infants of mothers who groomed beautifully and put them with mothers who didn't, and conversely, you took the infant rats of mothers who didn't groom so well, but you put them with mothers who did,
it changed.
It changed the brain for the adult.
It changed the brain?
It changed the genetic functioning, not the genes.
Okay.
But the genetic functioning. This is called epigenetics, how genes are turned on and off by the environment. And then those rats who were groomed well as infants, doesn't matter what the original mother was, but those rats who were groomed well, they went on to groom their infants in exactly the way they'd been groomed. So this is how we pass on our parenting stuff from one generation to the next, both behaviorally, but also through the turning on or off of certain genes.
So in essence, how nurturing our parents were has a big impact on our own ability to handle stress positively or negatively.
Oh, absolutely.
And then we pass that down to our
how
children.
Stressed our parents were, how they reacted to our own stresses as infants. That has everything to do with how our brains handle stress later on. And so some people just don't handle stress very well. They don't handle frustration very well. You should have seen me this morning at the hotel when the swimming pool didn't open in time, But I was a lot better than I might have been years ago, But yeah, our stress responses are very much programmed by our early developmental experiences.
Speaking about our early experiences, the first word in the sort of subtitle of your book is the word trauma.
Yeah.
It's a word that I've talked about a lot on this podcast, and I've had a lot of people here that have opened up about their traumas. How do you define trauma? I know society's defined it in its own way, but how do you define it, the word?
I define it very specifically. It's not something bad that happens to you. It's not that, I went to this movie last night and I was traumatized. No, you weren't. You were just sad, or had some emotional pain, but you weren't traumatized. Trauma means a wound. That's the literal meaning of the word. It's a Greek word for wounding. So trauma is a psychological wound that you sustain. And it behaves like a wound. So on the one hand, a wound, if it's very raw, if you touch it, it just really hurts. So if I have a wound around not being wanted, then, or the belief that I'm not, then decades later, if anything reminds me of that, it hurts as much as it did when I originally incurred the wound. So in one sense, trauma is an unhealed wound that touched, we get triggered. That's what triggering means, by the way. Some old wound gets activated or touched. And the other thing that happens to wounds is that they scar over. And scar tissue has certain characteristics. It's thick, it has no nerve endings, so there's no feeling in it. So people traumatized disconnect from their feelings. Scar tissue is rigid, it's not flexible. So we lose kind of response flexibility. So when something happens, we tend to react in typical, stereotypical, predictable, dysfunctional ways because of the rigidity. And scar tissue doesn't grow like healthy flesh. So people who are traumatized tend to be stuck in emotional states that characterized their development when they were traumatized. So when somebody says to you, "Don't be such a baby," it doesn't sound very pleasant, but there's some truth to it. It means that you're probably reacting according to the lines of some wound that you sustained as an infant, and now you're reacting as if that wound was happening all over again. This is what one of my friends in the trauma world, Peter Levine, calls the tyranny of the past. So something happens in the present, and we react as if we're back there in the past when this first happened, and we're not in the present moment at all.
And I was trying to figure out how many people, as a percentage of the population, have trauma. But then I read this stat that 60% of adults say that they've had a sort of a traumatic early upbringing or whatever, or traumatic events from their childhood. But then I thought maybe everybody has trauma.
It depends on how we understand trauma. So if we understand trauma as only the really terrible things that happen to people, which do happen to people, you know, in the book I talked about a British friend of mine now living in Canada. They are a yoga teacher and a meditation teacher and a psychologist and an artist, actually. And they grew up in some orphanage here in Britain where they were racially taunted every morning, you know, words that are in the book by her permission, which I'm not going to cite here publicly. And that gave her a sense of deficient, a sense of self, that I'm just not good enough, that I don't belong, and so on. There's those obvious traumas, or the obvious trauma of being sexually abused. So men who are sexually abused, according to a Canadian study, have tripled the rate of heart attacks as adults, you know, and all kinds of physiological reasons why that should be the case. So there's those self-evident, big T traumas that we call big T trauma, T with a capital T, trauma with a capital T. There's a certain percentage of the population, much larger than we think, subject to that. If you include all the known factors such as physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, spanking, by the way, has not been shown to be as traumatic as harsher forms of physical abuse. Spanking, which is still recommended by so-called experts, who shall remain unnamed for the moment. The death of a parent, violence in a family, parental violence against each other, a parent being jailed, a parent being mentally ill. Did I say a parent being addicted? A rancorous divorce. These are the identified big traumas, big T traumas. Not to mention poverty, not to mention extreme inequality, war, and so on. But then, if you remember that trauma is not what happens to you, but what happens inside you, it's the wound. People can be wounded not just by bad things happening to them, but small children can be wounded in loving families where they don't get their needs met. I mean, that's obvious in a physical sense. If a child doesn't get proper nutrition, their body will suffer, their mind will suffer. We're also creatures with emotional needs as important as our physical needs. So when the child's emotional needs are not met, that child is wounded. And that's what we call small T trauma, which is not the big ticket events, such as I described, but just the child's need to be loved unconditionally, to be held when distressed, to be responded to be seen, to be heard, to be allowed their full range of emotion without them being stamped on in the name of so-called discipline. the right to play creatively, spontaneously, out there in nature, not with these damn digital gadgets that subvert and hijack the child's imagination, but spontaneous play that's essential for brain development. So what I'm saying is that when these needs are not for the unconditional loving attachment relationship, when those needs are frustrated, children are also hurt. And I call that trauma as well, because it shows up later in life as the impact of painful wounds. So trauma in this society, for all kinds of reasons, is far more common than we imagine.
From sitting here and speaking to, I don't know, somewhere over 100 different people that come from all walks of life, but specifically people that are successful in their industries. And you talked about, you know, how an anomalous early upbringing can create sort of abnormality in an adult. A lot of the people I sit here are successful because of some kind of abnormality, or at least their interpretation of some kind of early event that caused them to have some sort of abnormal belief about themselves, that they're not enough, so they become a billionaire or a gold medalist or whatever it might be. One of the things that I thought I could predict is, I thought I could, if they told me, I thought after doing 100 episodes, if they told me the traumatic event they'd been through, I could predict the outcome in them. But there's a disconnect there, because, you know, I'd sit here with a guest who went through one of your tall capital T traumas, like domestic violence. And one of them might become incredibly angry. And one of them might become the most peaceful, loving person I've ever met. And that taught me that there's this thing in between the event, which is what you call interpretation. And I found that as that kind of makes it really difficult to diagnose.
Well, no, look, so the two examples you gave, that really peaceful person may be really peaceful for genuinely good reasons, such as they've found the milk of human love flowing through their veins, and they've had some spiritual reconciliation with the world, or they may have genuinely learned compassion for themselves and others. But they could also be very nice and peaceful because they're suppressing their healthy anger, because they're actually sitting on their rage unconsciously, which is going to show up in the form of some kind of health manifestation, I guarantee you, later on. So you can't tell from the outside without asking some questions. Or I can give you the example of a Donald Trump who had a really traumatic childhood. I mean, his father was as described by his psychologist niece, Mary Trump, his father, Trump's father, who is Mary's grandfather, was a psychopath, and who really demeaned and harshly treated their children. So Trump decides unconsciously that, by the way, I'm not talking about his policies here. This is not a political debate. And in the book, I point out that his opponent was also traumatized, Hillary Clinton. So this is a ecumenical view of trauma in politics. I'm not choosing sides. I'm just saying that you can see his trauma in every moment he opens his mouth. His grandiosity, his need to make himself bigger, more powerful, aggressive. And he's as much as said in his autobiography that the world is a horrible place, a dog-eat-dog place, where everybody is after you. Everybody wants your wife and your house and your wealth, and this is your friends, never mind your enemies. But that's the world he lives in. Now, that world that he lives in reflects his childhood home. He developed that worldview. He came to it honestly, you might say, because that's the world that he lived in. And he gets to be really successful in this crazy world. You know, financially, although people question, you know, was he really as big a success as he says he was? But he certainly was successful politically, if by success you mean the attainment of power. His brother, on the other hand, Mary Trump's father, Trump's niece's father, drank himself to death. And they were both responses to the same. You can never say it's exactly the same for two kids, but there was that toxic home environment. One ends up dead as an alcoholic. The other ends up at the pinnacle of power. And when I look at them both, I see dysfunction there, significant dysfunction there.
So one of the consequences of that early upbringing was it materialized itself as sort of addiction, and the other got the same psychological reinforcement, or the thing missing from power and work and money.
Well, Donald Trump learned that the way to survive is to be aggressive and harsh and competitive, and to get the other before they get to you. which is a faithful reproduction of his early childhood experiences. So for him, these were not choices so much as survival techniques. And when they talk about his lying, well, I don't know when he's lying and when he's not, but my sense is that often he actually believes what he's saying. And actually his biographer, or the person who co-wrote his quasi-autobiography called The Art of the Deal, this writer says that he's never met anybody who's so capable of believing something that's not true to be true if he wants it to be true. Now that's the mark of a traumatized child, you know, a denial of reality. It is an inauguration. There was a certain number of people that came to he couldn't stand it that there weren't as many people there as came to Barack Obama's inauguration. There were a much smaller number of people there. He created this reality where many more people came to his inauguration. Now, what age behavior is that? That's a 4-year-old, but more kids came to his party than my party. That can't be true. But that's Donald's way of dealing with reality. It's not a moral failing as such. That's how he survived. And these survival mechanisms then get to form our personalities. And again, in this world, sometimes they pay off in certain ways.
Is that often the case with pathological liars? They've learnt to lie as a way to survive.
Oh, absolutely. The German philosopher, writer Nietzsche, Friedrich Nietzsche said, people lie their way out of reality who have been hurt by reality. And so I've lied, you know, like when I had my shopping addiction, I lied every day to my wife, you know, and even afterwards, when she stopped trying to change my behavior, I said, just tell me, if you're going to shop, you're going to spend another $1,000 on music, just tell me. I still couldn't, because I was so ashamed of it. And so the lying became like a way of survival for me.
Defense against reality.
It's a defense against reality, and it's a defense against being judged, you know? Well, that says something about my childhood, you know? Nobody's born a liar. As we say in this book, there are congenital liars, but there are no congenital liars. No one-day-old baby tells any lies. No one-day-old baby pretends anything. If we end up pretending in any way at all, to the extent that we do, it's because we had to learn that's what we must do to survive.
You said something at the start when I gave the example that I sat with a guest here who went through domestic abuse, and they are the calmest person. And then you said, well, maybe they're suppressing it. And in fact, the minute you said that, it reminded me of something they said, which is they said to me on this podcast that they had angry outbursts all the time. So sometimes their child will come up to them and want to play when they're working, and they'll snap. And they're trying to deal with that.
Yeah, that's what I meant, that they're sitting on this volcanic crater of anger, which sometimes bursts out of them. So their demeanor is like a really developed, suppressed way of handling rage, which rage, when they were children, had they expressed, would have got them into more trouble. So suppressing it, repressing it, became their survival. It's all about survival, you see. So it became their survival mechanism. Now, that person, as long as they keep it that way, they're at risk. They're at risk for mental health diagnoses like depression. Because what is depression? It means you're pushing something down. That's all it means. What do we push down? Our natural emotions. Why do we push them down? Because we have to survive. So that person, I don't know, I can't prognosticate what's going to happen to them, but if they don't work it out, in general, they're at risk for some kind of mental or physical manifestation. That's my experience.
Quick one. Some of you may know we've got a brand new sponsor on this podcast, American Express. And you've got a brand new exclusive offer for a limited time only, which I can't wait to tell you about. From the 18th of October to the 16th of November, American Express is offering new card members a 60,000 point membership reward as a welcome bonus when you join, when you spend a minimum of £8,000 across the first 3 months. This is simply a thank you for joining American Express. And for those that don't know, you can use your American Express Business Platinum Card points in exchange for various rewards such as booking travel, holidays, gift cards, and so much more. So essentially, you're rewarded with huge prizes for just using their card to spend on your usual purchases. And I've had a look through at what 60,000 points can get you. So if you'd like to find out how you can get your hands on your new American Express Business Card, then search American Express Business Platinum Card to find out more. Quick one from our longest standing sponsor, Huel. I can't tell you over the last, really it's been about 2.5 years. It was really post-pandemic, how much my health has become such a huge priority in my life. Huel has been probably the most important partner in my health journey because I've been in the boardrooms, I've been to their offices tens of times. I've seen how they make their decisions on nutrition. And that's why it's such a wonderful thing to be able to talk to this audience about a brand and a product that is so unbelievably linked to my values and the place I am in my life of valuing the gym, exercise, movement, my mind, my breathing, and all of those things. And most importantly, my nutrition. That is the role Huel plays. And so every time I get to read these ads out, I do it with such passion because I really, really believe every word I'm saying. And I absolutely love the brand. So if you haven't already tried Huel and you've been resistant to my pestering, then give it a go and let me know how you get on. You talked about expressing one's emotions, and something you've talked about in this book, but also previously, is this idea that there is such a thing as healthy anger. Yeah. It's one of the 7 A's of healing, as you say. The first being a topic we've talked about already, which is acceptance. Yeah. The next being awareness.
Well, awareness I wish we had put into this book, but we didn't. Not into this book. In this book, I put 4 A's, and I left out awareness, and that was an omission on my part.
Really?
Yeah, it was. I'm sorry, but it was.
So in the book, you have authenticity, anger,
acceptance,
autonomy, agency,
authenticity, and agency. Yeah.
And acceptance. Yeah. So awareness. You've said before this book that awareness is the starting point.
Yeah.
I found that to be so true in my life, but it's not very easy. I feel like awareness is a luxury or a privilege that is very hard fought. Yeah. Because you're guessing. Yeah. You're guessing based on pattern recognition. So I was guessing 25 years old, I can't get into a relationship. Anytime a girl comes near me, even if I've pursued her, I run off. And to figure out why I was doing that, to even identify the behavior pattern and go, that's not helpful. That's not going to lead me to feeling whole. Yeah. Where does that come from? Took 25 years and a lot of introspection. But most people, they're living unaware of the puppet master of trauma that is driving their life. That's
a really good analogy. The trauma really is like a puppet master behind the scenes in the unconscious, pulling your strings, and you're not aware of it. You know, do you remember Pinocchio?
Yeah.
So you remember what Pinocchio says at the end when he finally becomes a real boy?
Yeah.
He says, how foolish I was when I was a puppet. And to the extent that we're being activated by these unconscious strings that our trauma is pulling behind the scenes, and we're acting in our lives and we think we're autonomous, free beings, but we're actually being controlled by something in the past that we haven't worked out, we're puppets. We're actually puppets. And there's not much freedom in that. There's no freedom in it at all. So, I mean, I suppose the opposite of trauma, if you want to revisit that question, is liberation.
Interesting. Liberation and by reconnection.
By reconnection, but liberation from the inexorable power of the unconscious.
Which is like cutting the strings in a way. Kind of brings me to, there's kind of 2 ways I want to go with that. But the first question I have about trauma and the puppet master analogy is, do we ever really cut the strings? Or do we just kind of learn to pull against them when they try and tell us to do something with more force than they're exerting in the opposite direction?
That doesn't work very well, pushing against it, because that's still reactive. You're still not in charge. You're just in automatic resistance mode to something. There's no freedom in that either, you know?
So still up.
So, yeah. But awareness that you mentioned is huge, because once you're aware that there's this, see, the thing about these strings may not fray right away, but once you're aware that, this reaction of mine, it's not about what's going on right now. There's something old being activated here. That awareness alone weakens it slackens the strings a bit. No, they're no longer as taut. They're no longer as automatically capable of pulling on you. So it does have to begin with awareness of them. Ultimately, if we realize that this puppet master is just a desperate little person trying to get you to survive, the only way he, she, they knew how when they were small, if we make friends with it, but we relieve it of its duties, saying thanks very much, but I can handle it now, it eventually becomes our friend rather than sort of our master, you know?
On that first step of just acknowledging, just understanding that there is a puppet master there controlling us, and exactly which strings that puppet master is pulling in our lives, how does one go about awareness, the process of awareness? Is it introspection, keeping a diary, therapy? What is it?
Well, all that. I mean, all or any. But even when you ask how you go about it, what is the it? Well, for you to say how to go about it, you already must have some degree of awareness. If you didn't, you wouldn't even be asking the question. So that's the very first step of realizing that there's something here to work on. There's something here to work through. It does not need to be the way it is. That already is the biggest step. The Buddha said that to recognize the source of your suffering is the first step towards relieving the suffering. And so as soon as you ask how you go about it, you've already taken a huge step. Because a lot of people don't even know that there's an it. They just think this is reality, that this is life. So realizing that this it doesn't have to be the way it is, that's already a huge step. Now, beyond that, yoga, meditation, nature, therapy of all kinds, body work of all kinds, like somatic experiencing, or craniosacral treatments, or even massage therapy. It's incredible what can be revealed just through body work like that. Then all kinds of forms of therapy, the ones I teach, the ones other people teach, journaling, certain exercises in this book that we recommend, like just ask yourself where you have trouble saying no in life to things you don't really want to do, and working that through on a regular basis. So there's lots of ways once you open the door. You know, I have a chapter on psychedelics here, which is, again, it's not like a panacea or for everyone, but certainly it's a helpful modality for a lot of people. So some people may actually benefit from taking pharmaceutical medications if their situation is dire enough, but not as the final answer, but as a way of getting respite that allowed them to go to work on the real issues that caused them to be depressed or anxious or tuning out, you know, so any and all of these things.
A lot of people don't even want to open those doors though, because there's so much pain associated with maybe going back or revisiting an early experience that they just think it's better keep the doors shut.
Yeah.
And get to tomorrow.
That's true. To which I have two answers. One is, it's true, it's painful. Because all the pain you didn't want to feel and you've been running away from through your compensatory behaviors, like your addictions, are nothing but an attempt to escape from pain. That's all they are. That's all they, you know, they're not a disease, they're not a genetic, whatever it is. Addictions are very simply an attempt to escape pain, which create more pain. But that's what they are. And so we get addicted to work, to sex, to pornography, to gambling, to the internet, to shopping, to eating, to power.
On that point, I find it so fascinating. When you mentioned in your previous book that, you know, you classified things like food, social media, shopping, porn and work as types of addiction. That was that in and of itself was a bit of a revelation for me, because I never saw work as an addiction. The minute you said it was, and I kind of link it to, you know, heroin addiction, which is providing a certain psychological or physiological benefit to me.
Yeah, temporarily.
Temporarily.
Yeah.
Of course it's a fucking addiction. Of course work is an addiction.
Well,
of course I have that addiction.
Well, work can be an addiction.
Yeah.
Work can also be sacred. It can also be fulfilling and a manifestation of your creative urges. But it's not the... But it's strange to say, not that I recommend it, but it's possible even to use heroin in a non-addictive way. I don't personally get it, and I would never want to. But the addiction is never in the behavior itself. It's in your relationship to the behavior. So if the particular activity gives you temporary relief or pleasure, and therefore you crave it, but it causes harm in the long term and you can't give it up, you've got an addiction. And I don't care what the activity is. It could be drugs and all the other things that we mentioned. And it employs the same brain circuits, by the way. The workaholic is after the same brain chemical that the cocaine addict is after, dopamine, you know. And people can be even addicted to their own stress hormones, like adrenaline, you know, the so-called adrenaline junkies. There's such a thing, you know. So almost anything can be addictive if it serves the purpose of temporarily easing some distress, but causing harm in the long term.
Is escapism the right word to use then for it? Because it doesn't sound as much like we're escaping rather than we are seeking something.
We're seeking missing. Relief from a certain mental state. Like I just gave you a definition of addiction, so think, I don't know what addictions you've had or haven't, or haven't besides, you know, but what did that do for you? Temporarily. It gave you something.
It made me feel like I was valid and I was pursuing a sense of accomplishment and validation.
Okay,
and
give you a sense of worth.
Yeah, I was worthy.
No,
yeah.
No. Is that something that people need or not?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a good thing. But the real question is, why did you ever get the idea that you didn't have the worth? Why did I get the idea that I didn't have the worth? That's where trauma comes in.
Because I was called the N-word when I was 8 by a kid in school.
Exactly.
And then no one would speak to me
And because
that
your
day.
mother screamed at your father.
Yeah.
You know,
I remember that day
and
very
so
vividly.
all that together. And that's emotionally painful. Like, what's it feel like to be, not to have a sense of worth? That's painful. And so that's why my mantra is, don't ask why the addiction, ask why the pain. And if you want to understand why the pain, you have to look at that person's life.
And what the benefit of the addiction is. That's something that you say in previous book that I found, it's a flipping of narrative where you say we should be asking what the benefit of the addiction is.
Well, and like in your case, it gives me a sense of worth. Well, okay, I'll say to you, if you come to me because you say, like, I'm workaholic, it's causing some harm in my life, it's keeping me from intimate relationships, it makes me stressed and tired, whatever it is, it's the first thing I would ask of you is, what is it doing for you? And you say a sense of worth. And I'd say, you know what? You deserve to have a sense of worth. I totally understand why you'd want to engage in an activity that gives it to you. But given that it's causing you harm, let's look at why you don't have a sense of worth and how else you might develop it that isn't harmful to you, you know? So, but you start with what's right about it. What are you looking for? And what you're looking for is always valid.
And how would one go about getting that sense of worth? I'm asking for a friend.
Well, that would be a matter of some form of work. People who meditate often deal with that issue through the meditation. Not always. Certainly therapy, you know. By recognizing also that what you're doing to get the sense of worth doesn't really do it for you, just by getting honest about it, you know? So there's all kinds of ways, but the first step is the recognition.
That's the first step that you say is missing from the book, which is that sort of awareness.
Yeah.
The next thing, which it's been really front of mind in my life recently, because I've been asked this a few times on stage and I've been trying to find the words to really articulate the importance of it, is, and this is one of your forays in this book about how to heal, is authenticity.
Yeah.
Really interesting concept, because I've been trying to articulate why the fact that I've just shared all this stuff with you and the fact that I do this every week, I'm getting closer and closer to that sort of authentic self where there's really, the mask is kind of dropping on me, why that's been so healing for me. Why is authenticity such a good way, an important way for us to heal?
It's much more than a way for us to heal. It's actually who we are. Like what you're really asking is is it important for a creature to be true to its own nature? Because that's what we're meant to do. We're meant to be here as ourselves, you know. And when we're not ourselves, because we had to abandon ourselves or betray ourselves or disconnect from ourselves in order to survive, we lost connections with our essence. And I mean, how does it feel to be a successful CEO and, you know, more than realizing your financial dreams, but to be a workaholic and not to be available to yourself in areas of your life that really matter to you, as opposed to being honest about your stuff, sharing it with other people, dropping the veil, I mean, to answer your question, what does it feel like? I mean, can you sense the difference in your body?
It feels lighter.
Well, yeah.
Expansive.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's the answer.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important.
So many of us live inauthentic lives because, as you said, it's either because from an early age we were escaping some kind of, you know, reality in order to help us to survive. Or then the other thing that happens a bit later on in life is we develop an identity, which becomes a career, which becomes a social circle, which becomes a prison of our inauthentic selves. We get trapped in there, you know, because I was good at something, or because I felt accepted in this job as a lawyer. So I am now living inauthentically as this robot in this prison. And there's often a real perception of risk and loss and danger of trying to get out of that prison, of trying to get close to our authentic selves. We feel like we'll lose our friendship circle. We'll feel like we'll let our parents down who wanted us to become a lawyer. You know, all of these things. I guess you see that a lot in your work.
Well, there is that risk, but here's the issue. As a child, you had no choice but to go for acceptance and being approved of and being received under any conditions. No matter what you had to give up of your authenticity, you had to give up your authenticity. You had no choice in the matter. At a certain point as adults, we learn that this lack of authenticity, this disconnection from ourselves, this separation from our gut feelings is costing us. It's costing us in terms of our physical health, our peace of mind, our relationship, our mental health, and so on. You'll never be as vulnerable again as you were when you were a child. You'll never be as helpless, as dependent, as resourceless. No, it's true that if you developed a whole set of relationships based on your inauthentic persona, some people in your life may not like it if you gradually move towards authenticity. They may not like it. It's not what they wanted from you. You're going to find out who your friends are. You're really going to find, because your real friends will say, oh, we're so happy for you. We were waiting for this. Other friends will say, it's not what I signed up for. You know. The question is, you still have to decide. As an infant, as a young child, I had no agency in the choice between authenticity and attachment. No, I do. Which one do I want to go with? What is the cost of being inauthentic? Now, I can't make that decision for anybody else. Nobody can make that decision for anybody else. But most people will find that choosing authenticity has benefits way beyond whatever they might lose. That's what I find.
And you said the word there, agency, which is the second of the 4 A's on how to heal. Now, agency, when I read that word, I hear like personal responsibility, taking personal responsibility over my life.
Exactly. Which also means not letting, you don't use you don't wear trauma as a badge, or you don't use it as a get out of jail pass in a game of Monopoly. Oh, I was traumatized, so I can't be any other way, I mean.
Giving all the power to the puppet master.
Yeah, exactly. So agency means actually I take the responsibility, not for what happened to me, not even how I interpreted the world as a result going backwards, but how I interpret the world from now on. Do I still want to interpret the world and my role in it based on some decision I made when I was a 1-year-old? That's where agency comes in. Agency also means that if I have any kind of dysfunction or illness. It's not just that I put my hands in the hands of put my fate in the hands of a physician or a healer, but I have agent. I make the decisions. I listen to your advice. I accept some, I don't accept some, but I'm the one who's making the decisions along with what seems right to me. So agency.
It's interesting in your work, throughout your work, you use alliteration as a lot as a way to kind of summarize and make ideas really memorable. It really helps.
It's an old trick.
It's a trick. It's a writing trick, right?
Well, it also works, you know, the 4 A's or
the 4 R's.
But I don't know what to say. You know, I'm denigrating my work if I say it's a trick. No, it's just something. It's just the way things occur to me. That's all it is.
One of the alliteration devices you use is also relates to limiting beliefs and how we can undo self-limiting beliefs with the 5 R's.
Yeah.
Relabel, reattribute, refocus, revalue, and recreate.
Yeah.
Now, from what I understood of those, relabeling is the story and the belief that is limiting to us. Sort of redefining it.
Take something like your workaholism.
Yeah.
I need to go to work. I need to do this work.
Yeah.
Relabeling as, I don't need to do this work. I just have a belief that I need to do this work.
Okay.
So that relabeling just takes a degree of separation from the behavior. And actually it's true. It's not that you need to do all this work, you have this belief. So relabeling just says it for what it is. By the way, I have to acknowledge that these 5 R's, only one of them is mine. I stole the other 4 from a psychiatrist.
That's fine. That's art.
I mentioned that in the book, but I find it a very helpful technique, but it was developed for people with obsessive compulsive tendencies. So the relabel is not that I have to wash my hand 100 times. I just have a belief that I have to wash my hand 100 times. That's the context in which it was developed. I think it works for all kinds of dynamics.
And then so I've relabeled it. I don't have to work to feel a sense of validation, but I have a belief that I do.
That's right.
And then I reattribute it, which is the second R, which means I get clear on where it's come from.
Yeah. So let's say you have the belief that you're not worth it. It's not true that I'm not worth it. I just have a belief that I'm not worth it. Okay? Or it may not be true that I'm not worth it, but I do have a belief that I'm not worth it. Attribute means this is an old brain circuit sending me an old message. It's got nothing to do with reality. It has to do with some experience that I had a long time ago. That's the reattribute. You just say, well, where's it actually coming from? There's a circuit in your brain that's wired with the message, you're not worth it. And it's going to keep repeating that message. Well, you say, okay, that's where it's coming from.
Until I refocus, which is the third R.
Yeah. So refocus is just to give yourself some space. So if you ever say, I need to go to work, okay, refocus means, well, for 5 minutes, maybe in 5 minutes I'll go to work, but for 5 minutes I won't. I'm going to put on some piece of music or go for a walk or meditate or whatever. So you refocus, you put the intention somewhere else. Just so that, to prove to yourself that you actually have some agency over your brain. If only for 5 minutes. If you have this belief that I'm not worth it, well, you can go back to it in 5 minutes if you want. Just for 5 minutes, though, consider all the ways that you made a contribution. Consider all the ways that people have acknowledged your benign presence in their lives. The times that people have told you that they've loved you or that you told somebody else. Just for 5 minutes, hang out with that. 5 minutes later, if you want to go back to this belief that, or if you can't help going back to this belief that you're not worth it, well, that's okay. But at least create some space. It's all about creating space between yourself and these beliefs or these behaviors.
And in that 5 minutes, you're basically accepting new evidence to be true, or you're proving that other evidence is true. I didn't need to go and work.
Well, you're also proving that you don't have to spend all your time subjected to those beliefs. You can take a hiatus from it, at least for a while.
And that they are not you.
They're not you, yeah.
And then revalue.
Reevaluate really what it should mean, or maybe more accurately, devalue, because you say, what has been the actual value? This belief that I'm not worth it, what has been the actual value of it in my life? Or this tendency of mine to be a workaholic, what has been the actual value? Oh, it made me tired, it made me alienated. or it keeps me depressed, or it keeps me hopelessly trying to prove something which I can never prove to myself anyway through external activity. So you actually look at what has been its actual impact on your life, what has been its real value.
Sometimes the value is positive though, right? Like I think about my own workaholism, if that's the term. I think, there's some positives here.
Yeah.
A lot of negatives.
Yeah. Well, is the positive due to workaholism, or is it due to your capacity to work hard on behalf of a goal? They're not the same. Mm-hmm. Your capacity to work hard to achieve a certain goal is simply a gift that you have, and something that maybe takes some discipline and application on your part. That's not workaholism. That's just a strong, positive work ethic. The workaholism is when you're driven to work, you actually don't need to.
It's funny because it reminds me of an analogy I've been talking about in the last couple of episodes of this podcast, the distinction between being driven and being dragged.
Yeah.
It's like, which side of the lorry am I flying down the motorway? Am I tied to the front and am I running and pulling the lorry? Or am I just like my ankles attached to the back of the lorry as it flies down the motorway because I'm being dragged?
But if I may, I would say that neither of those are particularly desirable. Being either, but it's the distinction that I made before between being driven and being called.
Yeah.
Because if you're called, see, if I call you, say, Stephen, would you come and have dinner with me? You can say yes, you can say no. I just gave you a call, and you could say, literally, I'm talking about a call now, telephone call.
Yeah.
You can say yes, you can say no.
There's a decision there.
But you're the one who's making the decision.
Yeah.
When you're dragged or pushed or pulled, you're not making the decision.
I'm a slave to the decision.
Yeah,
to that.
That's right.
To the activity.